Hi everyone, welcome, and before I begin I just want to give a special welcome to your teachers, your History Extension teachers, because they're the ones who generate the amazing students we then get at tertiary level. And often our History Extension graduate students are the best university history students that we get. So, and I remember when I went to high school, we didn't have something like the project back then, but I did have a great history teacher who inspired me to go on and follow this passion. So a big shout out to the teachers as well. Oh, the clicker, right. Okay, so there are two ways I think you can begin any history research project. Either you begin with a question that you wish to unravel and find some kind of answers to, such as who were the post-war migrants and what sort of Australia did they come to? Or you begin with an interesting case study, maybe an oral history you have done with a family member, maybe a letter or a diary you have in your possession from the past. And even when you have that amazing story or case study, you need to be able to ask the right questions of your material. The questions you begin with often lead to other questions, and the discoveries you make can often take you down very different paths to the one you first envisaged. So it's good to think of being an historian as being a bit like a detective. Questions lead to more questions, clues lead you down different paths. And this is something very important to keep in mind. Often I find, and this is not just at undergraduate level, it's students who I'm supervising for honours theses or PhDs, their doctorates, often find that students already have the answers before they begin, or they have preconceived assumptions and ideas that they then try to make their evidence fit to. But it should be the other way around. The real work of the historian is to be open to where your research takes you, where your data takes you, and it can very often take you to unexpected places. The best historians are open to the unexpected, and most importantly, the best historians have good imaginations, and I think that's one of the most important tools you can have, is a really good imagination. One famous historian, Natalie Zeman Davis, wrote a book called The Return of Martin Guerre. And the book is about a 16th century farmer in rural France, in a little village in France, whose identity was assumed by an imposter. And she had to ask, how do I resurrect the life of someone who lived in relative obscurity and for whom really there's hardly any archival material existing? So Davis tells us that where there was a gap in the construction of the historical event she was describing, she had to use other sources, other archival material to describe the wider world of her characters, contemporaries, and therefore also to conjecture about her characters' private lives. So 90% research, 10% invention is what Natalie Zeman Davis tells us. And I'm going to show you a little clip in which she is describing her work here.
The best research starts with curiosity. I'm thinking about the humanities, the fields that I know best, history, literature, philosophy. You begin because there's some subject that catches your eye, that intrigues you. Maybe something you've read or something you've heard. It's often motivated as well by some unanswered question in your field. It starts with you, but there's something in your field, something that other scholars have talked about, people have wondered about, and you begin to move with it. It can be an addition a topic that after you've thought about it for a while, turns out to be something that you think will have relevance for other people, not only other scholars, but other people around you. In my own work, I usually find that both things are happening at the same time, that I see a book or a fact from the past, some curious thing from maybe the 16th or 18th century. I think, wow, what's going on there? But it usually turns out that there's some other book that I've read, maybe by another scholar, that I'm reminded of. And then it's usually, often it's something that's suggested to me by a current issue. I may not realize it. For instance, one of the things I'm working on is identity. How is identity created? Religious identity, or political identity, ethnic identity, family identity. And I've been very interested in exploring people in the past who had mixed identities and see how they negotiated it. Well, sure enough, this is not just a scholarly question, it's one that's swirling around us all the time. So I think curiosity, passion for what you're doing is central in getting you started and central to some of the most creative work that scholars do. That's what sustains us. That's what makes our works important.
So we often think that it is the novelists and the fiction writers who have imagination, while historians just have dry as dust facts. But this is untrue. The best historians are great storytellers. And that's what I want to show you a little bit of today, how to be a good storyteller, but not a fantasist. We know the phrase, truth is stranger than fiction. And today I'm going to take you on one research journey I'm currently undertaking and try to show you through this the process, or my own process, of navigating the research. So about 20 years ago, my grandmother passed away on her birthday. March 25, 1996, she was 83. A few years later, my grandfather also died. When we were cleaning out their apartment, we found hundreds of letters. Some of them they'd sent to each other decades before, others were from their families in Europe. I also found something else, a garbage bag full of old recipes cut out from newspapers and women's magazines from the 1940s and 50s and 60s. None of this looked particularly interesting to me. Old recipes for Australian cuisine such as steak and pineapple, peach melba, corn chowder. And none of these I associated with my grandmother's cooking. I was about to haul the whole lot out to the recycling bin. I was standing at the recycling bin, I had the garbage bag, I was putting it in the bin, and I stopped and I thought, hang on a minute, this is one woman's archive. This is one woman's personal journey of assimilation into mid-20th Australia. So how to turn a case study such as this into a research project? What could a bag of old recipe cutouts possibly tell us about Australian history? So let's break this down. What did I begin to ask of this material? Well, firstly, I thought, well, why did my grandmother, a Hungarian Jewish refugee, collect these Australian recipes, more to the point, and keep them? Secondly, what does this collection tell us about 1940s and 1950s Australia? Thirdly, what does this collection tell us about the relationship between food and migration? Now, up until about 30 or 40 years ago, old recipes would never have been regarded as the stuff of history. History was understood to be about the exploits of great men, of kings and queens, of rulers, empires, conquests, battles. But in the late 1960s and early 1970s, a new history starts to emerge, social history, and Natalie Zemon-Davis was at the vanguard of this kind of new history. It became known as a history from below, with a new emphasis on the daily lives of ordinary people. So it turned attention to those peoples who were forgotten or silenced previously by history or by traditional kinds of history making. So migrants, women, non-white peoples, workers. An English historian called E.P. Thompson coined the phrase history from below, and he believed in agency. And he also believed that people were shapers of destiny, not just shaped by destiny. And that's quite an important point. And this new historiography also advocated for a radical expansion of what we understand as evidence, of primary evidence. So in order to create a truer picture of people's lives, people's pasts, historians needed to be able to glimpse into the interior, the private interiors of people's lives, and to see the often incomplete fragments they found there as important clues or markers of the practices of everyday life, the ways in which ordinary people experienced the world in the past, but also experienced the kind of epic events that we're used to studying. And this new social history turn wasn't just about new forms of evidence, it's also about how to read more the traditional forms of evidence, official sources. So reading official sources between the lines, questioning official sources rather than just seeing them as verbatim truth. So to return to my research project, I begin first with my grandmother and how she came to be in Australia. This is how I would shape this research project. My grandfather and grandmother were in Budapest in 1938. A young couple in love with a newborn baby. They were middle-class intellectuals, grandfather's a civil engineer, well-read, and so they thought, assimilated into Hungarian society and culture. But my grandfather had read the signs in 1938 and believed, most did not, but he suddenly believed that they had to leave Europe. Hitler was already in power, and when the Nazis annexed Austria, my Jewish grandparents decided it was time to leave, and they left. My great-grandfather had a police friend and was able to get them an exit visa out to Turkey, and they had to leave pretty much the next day. Now, does anyone know what today's date is? 9th of November. 9th of November 1938. Does anyone know what that is? Yes. Thank you. The last group didn't. Well done. Kristallnacht. Night of the Broken Glass. It's when Jewish shops and businesses were smashed by Nazis, Nazi thugs on the streets of Germany. And this was, of course, a time of rising violence against Jewish people in Germany and in other parts of Europe. But this kind of violence wasn't only being carried out by thugs breaking shop windows and beating people up. There was a different kind of violence being carried out against European Jews by governments worldwide who shut their doors to Jewish people trying to escape. Australia was one of them. There was a long tradition of anti-Semitism in Australia, as there was in Britain. And by 1938, secure havens for Jews were running out. In July 1938, Theodore Roosevelt, President of the United States, called the Evian Conference, attended by delegates from 32 nations, to deal with the question of Jews trying to find sanctuary. The only country that agreed to open its doors properly was the Dominican Republic. Australia agreed to accept 15,000 over 3 years, 5,000 per year. And this quota may have looked generous, but in fact it actually meant that fewer Jewish people were admitted to Australia if no quota had been set. So they designed a new immigration entry form in which you had to state whether you were Jewish or not. Only 3,000 arrived before Nazis overran Europe and there was no longer any possibility of escape. My grandparents and their son Michael were 3 of them, and they arrived here in March 1939. And this is their personal statement and immigration declaration when they arrived. And this is from the National Archives of Australia. Throughout this talk, what I'm going to try and do is just give you a taste of some of the incredible archives you have at your fingertips if you're doing an Australian research project. National Archives of Australia is one of these, okay, and they have immigration documents and all sorts of official documentation. Now, the tragedy of this was brought home to me when I also found on the National Archives website these applications for landing permits for Evie's sister and her husband and 2 small children, and the application for my grandfather's parents. These were approved by the Australian government, but by the time they were approved, it was already too late to get travel visas for Jews out of Europe. So they were trapped and eventually deported along with 565,000 other Hungarian Jews and perished in the Holocaust. When my grandparents arrived in Australia, they arrived to a completely foreign world. They found it hard to find somewhere to live, to find work, and my grandfather walked the streets looking for work as a civil engineer or as a draftsman. Now, they were initially met by the Australian Jewish Welfare Society, who helped refugees on arrival, and they were eternally grateful for this initial support. And I've just discovered that the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington actually has the entire archive of the Australian Jewish Welfare Society files. That's quite interesting discovery. I wasn't able to get to it before today to show you anything. Now, my grandparents arrived during an era known as the White Australia policy. What this meant is that non-British migrants had a difficult time being accepted. And don't forget, my grandparents were from Hungary, which became a German ally during the war, therefore an enemy of Australia and Britain, who were fighting on the side of the Allies. So this is the irony. Even though they were Jewish, they were classified as enemy aliens because of their Hungarian origins, but they left Hungary because they were being persecuted because of their Jewish origins. So my grandparents had to report to the local police station every week for the duration of the war. Post-war Australia is often nowadays in the public imagination imagined as an era of great prosperity, of suburban stability and security. And in particular, we have a nostalgic kind of association with the 1950s as an era of suburban security, the baby boomers, all that kind of thing. In fact, the post-war era was one of dramatic transition in Australian society, and yet it also carried with it a legacy of the decades that preceded it. And don't forget, Australia has gone now through 2 world wars and the Great Depression in a very short period of time. So there was a lot of deprivation and uncertainty that prevailed in these years, even as Australia is moving towards prosperity, a closer alignment with America. It's also the beginnings of a very different demographic makeup of the Australian population, and that's with Australia's first immigration program. So we didn't have an immigration department until 1945, and our first immigration minister was Arthur Calwell, and I'll show you him in a moment. Australia faced serious labour shortages at the end of the Second World War, particularly in coal mining, timber, steel, building and textile. And there's a huge demand for labour in remote areas to build infrastructure. Now, my research generally is looking at displaced persons, and by the end of the 1940s, Australia had accepted over 170,000 displaced persons from the camps in Europe, either of people who'd been displaced by the Second World War or people fleeing communism. And that's actually Australia took the second largest number of displaced persons after the United States. But ironically, despite knowledge of the Holocaust, Jewish migrants were still unwelcome in Australia, and Arthur Calwell imposed a strict quota on the number of Jews allowed to come out per ship. Their numbers were in fact strictly policed. So Jewish migrants, or Jewish refugees like my other grandparents on my mother's side and my 4-year-old mother, who'd been born in hiding in Budapest, had to come out here as sponsored migrants. They couldn't come out as refugees as all the other non-Jewish displaced persons did. This is Arthur Calwell, our very first Minister for Immigration. And he was sort of supervising this mass migration project and attempting to allay concerns within the general population about what this migration might mean for Australia. To do this, he oversaw the implementation of a policy of assimilation. Assimilation meant that migrants were expected to fit into an Australian way of life, to blend in, to not stand out. And part of this, for example, they put out a magazine called The Good Neighbour, which was aimed at migrants, distributed to migrant hostels, for example, aimed at helping migrants to assimilate into Australian culture, learn about the Australian way of life. And note, the phrase Australian way of life is actually invented at this time, in this period, to deal with these migrants, to deal with migration. The Good Neighbour, this is I found on this fantastic database. So if you're thinking of using an Australian research history topic, and I'm sure some of your teachers might have shown you this already, but Trove is a great resource. So I just put that up there to show you. I found out that Trove this is attached to the National Library of Australia, this database, and they've actually digitised the whole series of The Good Neighbour recently, so this is a really good resource. But it's important to note that assimilation isn't only directed at migrants. In fact, it's a policy directed at educating Australians to accept these new Australians in their midst and to assure the Australian public that their culture and society would not change, that they had nothing to fear by all these non-British people coming in. And there's a very real concern at this time about rate of change. I thought this was fun, Australian Women's Weekly, how to be nice to new Australians. And one of the cartoons, one of the captions says, "Don't laugh when in a continental gesture he kisses your hand. Accept his gallantries in the spirit in which they are offered." Now, the whole Australian Women's Weekly is down at the State Library of New South Wales. You can go and sit there and look through all these old copies. They're really fun. And another type of media that the Australian government, through its newly created Department of Information, is using is film. They're creating a whole lot of films to assist with this assimilation process. And I'm going to show you now one of the films that was made in 1950 by the Department of Information in collaboration with the Department of Immigration, was called No Strangers Here. And as I've written up here, it's a fictionalised account of a family arriving in a new town, a country town, and the film is created to counter anti-migrant prejudice in the late 1940s. And it's about a migrant family who move to a small town and spark a xenophobic outburst from the locals about the fact that new Australians have moved to their town. And what this source tells us is that the Australian people had to be educated, they had to be coaxed about the arrival of European migrants and encouraged to accept them. So assimilation is a two-way street. And in looking at something like this film, I also want you to be able to think about how you could use old films to interrogate them. Don't accept them as fact. Interrogate them about what they tell you about the period in which they're made. So let's have a look at a few minutes of this.
First, you use a kilogram flour.
Use 1 kilogram.
Now, and this is the local editor of the newspaper, the man.
Of 3 full cups.
Then mix it in half-liter milk.
1 liter
1/2 cups milk.
or 1/2 cup.
1.5.
Oh, I see. 1.5 cups.
Yes.
Stir well.
Yes, it is easy to mix.
Easy to mix.
The cake was something new to him, but the ingredients were just the same as he'd seen his wife use time and time again.
Oh, and then what?
Oh, put in a cinnamon.
Cinnamon. How much?
How much? Messerspitze?
Messerspitze. Enough to cover 6
Yes. Always watch time.
Bake until well browned. Bake until well browned. Oh, Ted.
Yes.
Print this in the woman's page tomorrow. And head it, easy to mix.
Easy to mix. Can Littleton women cook?
Can Littleton women cook?
Can Littleton women cook? Can Littleton women cook? Can Littleton women cook? Alle Flour. Can Littleton women cook? Cook. 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 Always watch time.
Oh, no.
Well, my little experiment worked. Here, I tried your almond cake, and we all liked it very much. Dear Mr. Editor, can we have another recipe like that? Dear sir, even my wife could get it right. Oh, I like this one. Mine was flat and sodden. Was there a printing error?
Well, here were real Australians showing their interest in things foreign, even in such a little thing as a cake.
But then, life is made up of little things.
Okay. This film is available on the National Film and Sound Archive official YouTube channel. So and the National Film and Sound Archive is another great source for you. This film tells us something about the association also of women's roles as homemakers and housewives that was entrenched in this period. This is also interesting in terms of Australian history because during World War II, with much of the male population at war, women were brought out of the homes and into the workforce to contribute to the war effort. After the war, there's a concerted official effort to get women back into the home again. And in fact, improved housing, better education, the goal of full employment, economic reconstruction after the war, were all geared towards those things that would encourage a secure environment for male breadwinners and female homemakers and families. And if we look at the examples of the Australian Women's Weekly pages from this period, you see this reinforcement of the woman's roles as wives, as homemakers, as mothers. And I'll just give you a taste of something else along these lines. I think this is a little bit fun too.
She knows that somewhere in this room there's a small brown paper parcel, and inside that parcel is the thyme, sage and marjoram that she needs for seasoning. But do you think she can find it? Not on your life. What's this? Roast chicken without stuffing. I don't like this at all. What's wrong now? This horrible scene comes into her mind.
What about some stuffing?
Yes, please. Oh dear, we can't let that happen. Ah, you've remembered where you put that parcel, have you? Well, it looks as if we're going to have our seasoning after all. But if you ask me, I'd rather have no seasoning at all than this stuff, full of bread with a sprinkling of onion and just the taste of herbs. That's what this seasoning's going to be like. That's right, fill it up with bread. But I'm afraid your husband's boss isn't going to ask for a second helping of that seasoning, dear lady. We'd better do something about this. Just a minute. This is what you need. There you are, your troubles are over. Just open that packet of Tandico stuffing, pour some of that mixture into a bowl, add some boiling water, mix it, and you've got the most delicious seasoning you've ever eaten. None of that crying your eyes out while you cut up an onion, that is if you're lucky enough to get an onion. None of the trouble of hunting high and low for that parcel of herbs, that is if you've got any herbs. Your seasoning's right there inside that Tandico packet.
There's no doubt about this homemade stuffing, you can't beat it.
For really tasty cutlets, dab them in Tandico seasoning instead of crumbs. And for stuffed baked rabbits, leg of mutton, or stuffed tomatoes, Whenever you want seasoning, remember, your grocer has Tandico.
So just a little bit of film history there. Of course, this is pre-television days, so these kind of ads, when you went to the cinema, you'd have your newsreels, and then you'd have your ads, and then you'd have your movie. So this is where people saw these ads, not on a television. And we can also see in this ad the emphasis on efficiency in the kitchen. There's an ideology of efficiency that is part of this post-war culture of consumerism, of modernity, and of technological progress. Housewifery was being transformed at this time into a rational activity, a set of routines that, if done correctly, reflected the machine-like precision desired of a good housewife who could manage her home with assembly-like efficiency. Now back to the recipes. Digging around in this garbage bag, I discovered a few other interesting items. Letters my grandmother wrote and must never have sent to local women asking for lamington recipes. I think this was her way of reaching out, of attempting to demonstrate her aspiration to assimilate, to make friends. She must have felt very isolated without friends or family, at home alone with a small baby while my grandfather was out trying to find work or working. And as I never tasted once any Australian food on my grandmother's table, I wonder whether her collecting of the recipes was also a way of learning about her new country, about trying to adapt. I'm not sure whether Grandma ever received any recipes for lamingtons from her neighbours either. They certainly didn't appreciate her own cake making. When they first arrived, after a few months, they ended up in Albury, Wodonga, where my grandfather was able to get work as a draftsman. And if you can imagine in those days, Albury Wodonga, and two middle-class intellectuals, bourgeois, coming from Budapest, being dumped in Albury Wodonga in 1938 was pretty tough for them, and not really speaking English. And my grandmother tells a story about how she made chestnut puree, which is a very labour-intensive dessert, Hungarian dessert. And she tells the story about how she slaved for 3 days to make this dessert, only to have the Australian guests reject to even taste it. So this was a very humiliating moment in her life. The kind of food that Australians ate in these years would have been fairly alien to my grandmother as well. It was a time when garlic was only found in the Chinese quarters in Chinatown, when olive oil was sold in chemists, and when spaghetti bolognese was only found in the European exotic section of the cookbook. And food was actually an important assimilationist device in these years. It was expected by immigration officials that new arrivals should be introduced to Australian food and cooking and should adopt their host nation's ways. And it's interesting to note that the history of food is a growing field at the moment. For settler countries like Australia and the United States, the role of food as a mediating influence in the migrant experience is an emerging theme. So how did migrants like my grandmother adjust to the Australian diet, which was mainly a British diet, that we fondly remember now as overcooked soggy vegetables, tinned food and sweet tea, along with the classic rabbit and mutton and dripping, which is sheep fat. I think this is really good. It's a recipe for rabbit and banana loaf. And devilled lamb's head. In fact, for thousands of immigrants arriving in Australia in this period, their early encounters with food was a fundamental moment in their settlement experience. And Italian migrant Steve Manfredi writes, "We left behind more than a country when we got off the boat and went to live in that migrant hostel. We'd left behind an entire culture. And in daily life, that culture was expressed in the preparation and eating of food." But as we can also see, it was Australian food that was transformed, and not just the other way around. In fact, despite official attempts to get migrants to adopt Australian cooking, slowly the reverse began to happen. Particularly when we discuss migration, which is often associated with the trauma of being uprooted, and particularly in the case of refugees, historians are beginning to recognise that food is more than just nutrition or sustenance. Because of its deep connections to family, culture and identity, what is cooked, how it is cooked and how it is served can be very important. It can be linked to past life and it can be a means of maintaining tradition and family. And here I think we need to return to the earlier point I made about agency. While second-wave feminists of the 1970s might have seen the domestic role of women as oppressive and everyday practices of food and cooking as evidence of powerlessness and oppression and patriarchal oppression, nowadays I think there's a different approach. People like my grandmother were able to exercise their own agency in the home and to resist certain dominant discourses of efficiency or domesticity, sort of as I showed you in these ads, and negotiate their own identities. They weren't only wives and mothers, housewives and cooks, but also dressmakers, readers, intellectuals, interior designers. But I think we shouldn't push the notion of agency too far either, and there was a period when historians possibly did push that too far, I think. Other migrant women who came after my grandmother, particularly those from southern Europe, were pushed into low-paying menial jobs, often back-breaking, badly paid factory labour, while still expected to maintain households, rear children and, of course, cook. These double pressures often meant that migrant women fared even harder than migrant men. I also found something else at the bottom of that garbage bag. a recipe book. It was literally at the bottom, with recipes mainly in Hungarian in her tiny script. But tucked into the pages were also letters she had received from her family during the 1940s, before her family was deported to Auschwitz and before they had any inkling that this was going to happen. And this takes us to another aspect of this research project. For women, cookbooks and how women created these is another form of evidence. So the fact that she kept these letters in her cookbook, I think is important. Why in the cookbook? Cookbooks were places in which women left recipes, but also photographs, letters, invitations. Now, these letters were some of the last items, or in fact the last items my grandmother ever had of her family. And the fact that she kept them in her cookbook, I think, is testament to the ways in which cookbooks were much more than a set of instructions. For many women, they were also a diary, a daily record of domestic life, of family life, a place to record opinions, and even opinions on the world and current events. The cookbooks of our grandmothers are primary sources, in other words, that are maps of the social and cultural worlds their writers inhabited. Throughout this research project, another important source has been family oral histories. And this is where I encourage you, if you're perhaps struggling with an idea, you all have people in your families who've lived through epic events of the 20th century. So mapping a personal story onto those epic backdrops make fabulous research projects. And if you're not interested in your own oral histories, actually the State Library of New South Wales has a fantastic oral history collection as well. Now, throughout this project, I've been able to utilise an incredibly rich, and I've totally forgotten about my PowerPoint, I'm sorry, and yes. This slide was just to show you about how that encounter between new and old Australians starts to transform our food culture. This is about cookbooks, so yes. Throughout this project, I've been able to utilise an incredibly rich and diverse set of archives. The National Film and Sound Archive, for example, Trove, the National Archives of Australia, oral histories at the State Library of New South Wales or at the National Library in Canberra, if you feel like a trip down there. And look in your own backyards. Think about what topics are interesting to you now and what the history of that topic might be. For me, it's migrants and refugees. For you, it might be something else. And I just wanted to finish by showing you that often there's something that's going on, and what Natalie Zeman-Davis referred to, what's happening in your own world right now, the sort of cultural milieu in which you are living, often triggers an interest in us. So I thought I'd just show you the official trailer, and I'm sure some of you have seen this film, to think about how my research project is also, the themes in my research project are also wider themes of public discussion at the moment. So, Jimmy, I thought we might show Ladies in Black, the trailer.
Morning, Miss Cartwright.
Morning, Miss Cartwright. Miss Baines, Mrs. Williams, this is Miss Miles. These ladies will show you the ropes.
Good afternoon, ladies. You must be the new jeune fille. Some help I can use during this season.
Who's that?
Magda, one of them refos.
Refugees. Migrants. This came for you.
Oh, Dad will have to sign this. Dad, I need you to sign this form.
Look, I've told you before, no daughter of mine is going to university.
We'll think of something.
Oh, he was all over me. They only want one thing. All of them.
I mean, what do you expect? They're gonna kiss your hand and throw their coats over drains? Sorry, excuse me.
I always knew that I'd lose you someday.
Oh, no, you'll never lose me. I'll stay with you always.
I hope so. But now something more important. Your dad's dinner.
Rudy needs assistance. I wish to find a girlfriend. I want an Australian girl.
An Australian?
Yes, some of them are very beautiful.
The cultivated ones have gone away.
Magda, there is someone.
She's rough. She's no style. Perfect.
Who's going to be at Magda's party? Are you meeting someone?
No, I won't know anyone. I think they'll all be continentals.
Do you speak English?
Of course. And Hungarian and German. And some French and Russian. A drink?
Look, Mum. Magda gave me this, and her husband made us a lovely lunch.
He made the lunch.
European men like to cook.
Oh, I like to drink. I'm off to the pub. See you in a couple of hours.
Magnificent!
You want to be careful. I don't want to see you get hurt.
You're a clever girl. It's the most wonderful thing in all creation, you know?
Perhaps you will be a businesswoman. There are worse things. Oh, I should have gone to Mass this morning. Too late now.
I'm sure God will understand.
Okay, leave it there.